You know what's crazy? Everyone thinks that if you're the one getting proposed to, you automatically have all the power in the relationship. Like he's the one who wants to lock it down, so obviously he'll do whatever it takes to keep you happy, right? That's what I thought anyway. I'm Stella, I'm 27, and I figured I had this whole thing figured out. Owen and I had been together for 3 years. 3 solid years where I thought I was playing chess while he was playing checkers. We met at some mutual friends' party, and honestly, he wasn't even my type at first. Not the guy I usually went for, you know? But he was stable, had his shit together, worked in some office job doing paperwork that honestly bored me to tears when he tried to explain it. But stable was good. Stable meant marriage material. And at 27, with all my friends, either engaged or married, stable was exactly what I needed. Owen was the kind of guy who'd remember to pick up groceries without being asked, who'd drive me to the airport at 5 a.m. without complaining, who'd listen to me vent about my asshole manager at work and actually seem interested. He was reliable in that way that should have made me grateful, but instead just made me feel secure enough to test boundaries. Looking back now, I think that's when everything started going sideways. When I got too comfortable assuming he'd never actually leave. Because guys like Owen don't just walk away from 3-year relationships, right? They're too invested, too nice, too worried about starting over. At least that's what I convinced myself of when I started implementing what I now realize was probably the dumbest strategy in relationship history. But at the time, it felt genius. It felt like I was finally taking control of my own timeline instead of just waiting around for him to decide when he was ready to propose. See, I had this theory. If I made myself less available, especially in the bedroom, he'd realize what he could lose and finally step up. It wasn't like I was being mean about it or anything. I just pulled back. Started treating intimacy like a reward system instead of something we both enjoyed. I figured scarcity creates value, right? That's basic economics. And honestly, I was getting tired of him getting comfortable while I was still waiting for a ring. 3 years is long enough to know if you want to marry someone, and I was done being the cool girlfriend who never brought up the future. So yeah, I started my little experiment. And for a while there, I thought I was winning. The thing about Owen was that he never really fought back when I started changing the rules. That should have been my first red flag, honestly. Like when I started making excuses about being tired or having headaches or just not being in the mood, he didn't push. He didn't get angry or demanding like some guys would. He just accepted it, which at the time I took as proof that he respected me and my boundaries. Looking back, I think he was just checking out mentally, but I was too focused on my master plan to notice. I mean, we still did stuff sometimes, but I made sure it was on my terms when I wanted to, and only after he'd done something to earn it. Took me out somewhere nice, helped me with something around my apartment, bought me those expensive face masks I liked. I turned our entire relationship into this weird transaction system where I was always the one holding the cards. And the crazy thing is, I actually started to believe that this was how relationships were supposed to work. That I was being smart and strategic instead of, manipulative as hell. I'd watch him trying to figure out what he'd done wrong when I'd suddenly get cold. And instead of feeling bad about it, I felt powerful. Like I was finally in control of something instead of just waiting around for him to make decisions about our future. My sister Paige kept telling me I was playing with fire, but I thought she was just jealous because her boyfriend at the time was a complete loser who couldn't even hold down a job. What did she know about relationship strategy? Owen was devoted to me, maybe even a little obsessed, and I was just using that to my advantage. That's what smart women do, right? We use what we have to get what we want. And what I wanted was a ring on my finger before my 28th birthday. I had it all planned out in my head, the proposal, the wedding, the whole timeline. I just needed Owen to catch up to my vision. So I kept pulling back, kept making him work for every little bit of affection, convinced that any day now he'd realize he needed to lock me down before he lost me. God, I was such an idiot. Owen started working later, which I initially took as a good sign. Like maybe he was saving up for a ring or planning something special. He'd come home around 8 or 9 instead of his usual 6, looking tired and kind of distant. When I'd ask about his day, he'd give me these one-word answers that honestly started to piss me off. I mean, I'm trying to have a conversation here, and he's acting like I'm bothering him. So naturally, I pulled back even more. If he wanted to be all moody and unavailable, fine. Two could play that game. I started making plans without him, going out with my coworkers more often, posting pictures on Facebook where I looked amazing and happy without him in the frame. Let him wonder what I was up to for once. The funny thing is, he never asked, never seemed jealous or worried about me being out without him. Just said, "Have fun," when I'd tell him I was going out with Madison and the girls from work. Which honestly should have concerned me more than it did, but I was too busy being proud of myself for not being the clingy girlfriend who needed constant reassurance. I was independent, mysterious, keeping him on his toes. That's what all the relationship advice articles said to do, right? Don't be too available, maintain your own life, make him chase you. What they don't tell you is what happens when he stops chasing entirely. When Owen started going to bed earlier than me, I told myself it was just work stress. When he stopped trying to initiate anything physical, I convinced myself my strategy was working and he was learning to respect my boundaries. When he stopped bringing me little surprises or planning date nights, I figured he was finally understanding that he needed to step up his game if he wanted my attention. I was creating the perfect conditions for a proposal, making him realize what life would be like without me. Except apparently I was actually giving him a preview of what life would be like without me, and he was discovering that it wasn't nearly as devastating as I thought it would be. But I was too wrapped up in my own narrative to see what was really happening. I thought I was training him to value me more. Turns out, I was just teaching him how to live without me. By month 6 of my brilliant strategy, Owen had basically turned into a roommate who occasionally said good morning. We were living together but existing in completely separate worlds, and somehow I'd convinced myself this was exactly where I wanted him. Grateful for whatever scraps of attention I threw his way, desperate to win back my affection, ready to do whatever it took to make me happy again. Except he wasn't desperate. He wasn't grateful. He was just done. But I couldn't see it, because I was too busy being impressed with my own manipulation skills. When he'd come home from work and go straight to his computer or start reading some book, I'd tell myself he was giving me space to come to him. When he stopped complaining about our non-existent sex life, I thought I'd successfully trained him to be patient. When he stopped trying to plan romantic dinners or surprise me with things I liked, I figured he was saving his energy for the big proposal moment. I mean, that had to be what this was building up to, right? All this distance and tension had to be leading somewhere. Guys don't just accept a complete shutdown in intimacy unless they're planning something big. Unless they're working up the courage to take the next step. I had convinced myself that Owen's withdrawal was actually him preparing to level up our relationship. Like, he was pulling back to create space for something bigger and better. And yeah, okay, maybe I was getting a little impatient with how long it was taking. Maybe I started dropping even bigger hints about marriage, talking about my friends' engagement rings when we'd scroll through Facebook together, mentioning how nice it would be to have a wedding in the spring. But I wasn't being desperate or anything. I was just guiding him toward the obvious conclusion. The conclusion that any reasonable person would reach after 3 years together and a girlfriend who was clearly ready to take things to the next level. What I didn't realize was that Owen had reached a conclusion too. Just not the one I was expecting. The conversation that ended everything started so normally that I almost didn't recognize it as the beginning of the end. Owen came home from work on a Thursday, which was weird because he'd been staying late most nights, and found me on the couch watching some reality show about people renovating houses. I was in full comfort mode, messy bun, old college sweatshirt. The works. Not exactly trying to be seductive, but that was kind of the point, right? I wasn't going to reward him for finally coming home at a decent hour. He needed to earn back my attention after all those late nights and weird, distant behavior. So when he sat down next to me and said we needed to talk, I figured he was finally ready to have the conversation about our future. Maybe apologize for being so checked out lately, promise to be more present, ask what he could do to make me happy. You know, all the stuff that comes before the big romantic gesture. But instead, he started asking me these questions that caught me completely off guard. Like, whether I was happy in our relationship, whether I felt like we were compatible long term, whether I thought we wanted the same things. And I'm sitting there thinking, duh, of course we want the same things. We want to get married and build a life together. That's literally what I've been working toward this entire time. So I told him yes, obviously, we're perfect together, we just need to take the next step. That's when he got this weird look on his face and said something that made my blood freeze. He said he'd been doing some thinking about our physical relationship, about how things had changed over the past few months, about how I seemed less interested in being intimate with him. And before I could explain my strategy or tell him that it was all building towards something better, he said the words that completely derailed my entire plan. He said he didn't think we were sexually compatible, that he couldn't imagine spending the rest of his life in a relationship where intimacy felt like a chore or a favor, that he deserved to be with someone who actually wanted him, not someone who treated physical affection like a bargaining chip. I started to panic because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to realize how much he needed me, not question whether we belonged together at all. That's when I made my biggest mistake. Instead of backing down or explaining what I'd been doing, I doubled down. I told him that I could give him the best sex of his life if I wanted to, but I just didn't feel like it. I said I was capable of rocking his world, I just chose not to, because he hadn't earned it yet. I actually said those words out loud, like they were something to be proud of. Like I was revealing some kind of superpower instead of admitting to months of manipulation and withholding. The look on Owen's face when I said that, it wasn't anger or hurt or even surprise. It was just this cold recognition, like everything suddenly made sense to him. He asked me point blank if I'd been withholding sex to try to get him to propose. And instead of lying or trying to cover my tracks, I told him the truth. I said yes, obviously, that's how relationships work. You don't just give everything away for free and hope the guy eventually decides you're worth committing to. You create incentives. You make him work for it. You show him what he could lose if he doesn't step up. I explained my whole strategy like it was some brilliant business plan, thinking that maybe if he understood the logic behind it, he'd appreciate how much thought I'd put into our future. Instead, he just stared at me for what felt like forever, and then said the most devastating thing anyone has ever said to me. He said he couldn't force me to want him, and he didn't want to be with someone who thought love was supposed to be earned through good behavior. He said we were incompatible in a fundamental way that couldn't be fixed, and he was done trying to figure out what he'd done wrong to make me pull away. That's when I realized that my brilliant plan had backfired in the worst possible way. I thought I was making myself more valuable by creating scarcity. Instead, I just made him realize that maybe he didn't want what I was selling after all. And the worst part? There was no taking it back. I couldn't undo months of manipulation and explain that I'd actually wanted him all along. I couldn't convince him that my strategy was separate from my actual feelings. Because honestly, after all that time of treating intimacy like a weapon, I wasn't even sure what my actual feelings were anymore. Owen told me to pack my things and be out by the weekend. Just like that. 3 years together, and he was giving me 3 days to find somewhere else to live. I tried everything. Crying, apologizing, promising things would be different, even offering to prove right then and there how good things could be between us. But he just shook his head and said it was too late for all that I'd shown him exactly who I was and what I thought our relationship was worth, and he believed me. He said he couldn't trust that any future intimacy between us would be genuine, instead of just another manipulation tactic. That he'd rather be alone than spend his life wondering whether his girlfriend actually wanted him or was just performing to get what she wanted. I kept trying to explain that I did want him, that the whole thing had just gotten out of hand, that I'd made a mistake in how I'd handled things. But he wasn't buying it. He said that if I'd really wanted him, I wouldn't have been able to turn it off like a faucet for months. That if I'd really loved him, I wouldn't have used his feelings for me as leverage to get what I wanted. And honestly, I didn't have a good answer for that. Because deep down, I knew he was right. I had treated our relationship like a game where I was trying to win instead of something we were building together. I'd been so focused on getting to the finish line that I'd forgotten we were supposed to be running the race as a team. But admitting that felt like admitting that I'd destroyed the best relationship I'd ever had for literally no reason, except my own impatience and need for control. So instead of taking responsibility, I got angry. I told him he was being dramatic and throwing away 3 years over a few months of me not being in the mood. I said he was proving that all he cared about was sex anyway, and maybe I'd been right to hold back if that's all our relationship meant to him. I accused him of never really loving me if he could just turn it off this easily. Basically, I said every terrible thing I could think of to try to hurt him the way he was hurting me. But Owen just listened to all of it with this sad expression, like he was watching me confirm everything he'd already figured out about who I really was. When I finally ran out of cruel things to say, he just told me he'd be staying at John's place until I moved out, and he hoped I'd find someone who was willing to play the games I seemed to need in a relationship. Then he left, and I was alone in our apartment with the reality of what I'd done. The next few days were a blur of panic and desperate damage control. I called him obsessively, left voicemails apologizing and begging for another chance. I texted him essays about how I'd just been scared of getting hurt, how I'd misunderstood what relationships were supposed to be like, how I was willing to change everything if he'd just come home and talk to me. I even showed up at John's apartment, but Owen wouldn't come to the door. John told me that Owen had asked him to tell me that everything that needed to be said had already been said, and continuing to contact him was just making things worse. That's when I realized he was serious about this being over, that all my pleading and promising wasn't going to fix what I'd broken. So I moved out, went to stay with Paige while I figured out my next steps, and spent weeks alternating between rage and self-pity. I'd tell anyone who would listen that Owen had dumped me over sex, leaving out the part about months of manipulation and emotional withholding. I made myself the victim of his unrealistic expectations and refusal to communicate. I convinced myself that he was just too immature to handle a real relationship where you had to work for what you wanted. But even as I was spinning that narrative, I knew it wasn't true. I knew I'd fucked up in a way that couldn't be undone. I'd turned love into a transaction, and then acted surprised when he decided he didn't want to pay my prices anymore. The worst part was that I started hearing things through mutual friends about how much happier Owen seemed, how he'd started going out more, picked up some new hobbies, seemed like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. People would tell me this stuff, thinking it would make me feel better, like, oh good, you're both doing well apart. But all it did was confirm that our relationship had been dragging him down in ways I'd never even noticed. That my strategy hadn't just failed, it had been actively making both of us miserable, and I'd been too self-absorbed to see it. And yeah, maybe part of me had hoped that after a few weeks apart, he'd realize he missed me and want to work things out. But as the months went by, it became clear that Owen was moving on with his life, like our 3 years together had just been a learning experience he was grateful to be done with. It's been almost a year now, and I've had to face some uncomfortable truths about who I am and what I did. Not because I wanted to, but because reality has a way of forcing accountability, whether you're ready for it or not. I've been in therapy, partly because Paige insisted, and partly because I couldn't figure out how I'd managed to sabotage the most stable relationship I'd ever had. My therapist keeps asking me questions that I don't want to answer, like whether I actually missed Owen or just missed having a boyfriend. Whether I was more upset about losing him specifically or about having to start over with someone new. Whether I'd been trying to create intimacy or just trying to control him. And honestly, I'm still not sure I like the answers I'm coming up with. What I do know is that I hear about Owen sometimes, usually when I'm least prepared for it. How he's been dating someone for a few months now, someone he met through work who seems really good for him. How they went on some weekend trip together and looked genuinely happy in the pictures someone posted. How different he seems with her, more relaxed, more himself, more willing to be vulnerable. And I wish I could say that hearing all this made me want to be a better person, or learn from my mistakes or whatever. But mostly it just makes me angry. Angry that he gets to be happy while I'm still figuring out how to trust my own feelings. Angry that he found someone who apparently doesn't need to play games to get what she wants from a relationship. Angry that I wasted 3 years trying to manipulate someone into loving me the way I thought I deserved, only to find out that what I thought I deserved wasn't actually love at all. Maybe someday, I'll be grateful that Owen forced me to confront all this stuff about myself. Maybe I'll look back on this whole mess as the wake-up call I needed to become a better partner for someone else. But right now, all I can think about is how I had everything I thought I wanted and threw it away because I was too proud and too scared to just ask for what I needed. And the worst part? I'm still not entirely convinced I was wrong to want some guarantees before giving everything away. I'm still not sure I believe in the kind of love that doesn't require any strategy or protection or careful calculation of risk and reward. Which probably means I'm still not ready for the kind of relationship Owen has now. And maybe that's exactly what I deserve.